Okay, so here is a mid-sagittal slice through the brain, right? And this area that surrounds the corpus callosum, right, which includes, for example, the cingulate gyrus, which is a really critical area that's involved in a lot of important functions we'll see that are actually to some extent emotional in nature and motivational in nature. This area around the corpus callosum was described by a famous neuroscientist or neurologist named Paul Broca, who is famous for his work with patients who had difficulty expressing language, something known as Broca's aphasia today. But he referred to this area as a separate lobe of the brain. He called this the limbic lobe because limbus means border, and these were the areas of cortex that were medial that bordered the corpus callosum. So it turns out that there are a number of structures that are largely deep in the brain and largely ancient in an evolutionary sense. So they include, for example, old areas of cortex. We're going to soon discuss what's known as neocortex, which has a kind of more consistency in terms of the circuitry and networking. But these older areas of cortex, like the anterior cingulate, right, or the cingulate gyrus as a whole, and the hippocampus, we're going to see, for example, actually have more unique architecture, more unique sort of structural architecture. They have fewer layers than neocortex, we'll see. And they've been around a lot longer. And they also seem to be very involved in emotionally salient or significant aspects of behavior and perception. So the areas that are involved in emotional experience and expression, many of them do border, the corpus callosum. Many of them are actually, in Broca's, historical limbic lobe. So this system of structures is sometimes referred to as the limbic system. And it's several interconnected cortical and subcortical structures that are important for emotional salience, and felt experience and memory. So what's interesting is it includes a number of old cortical regions. Again, the anterior cingulate is one, and also the hippocampus is another. That's an important medial temporal lobe structure that is essential for or very, very involved in remembering specific episodes and comparing what's happening now to things that might seem that are similar in some ways. I'm going to show you really quickly. So here's the temporal lobe, right? Again, here's our lateral fissure. If I open through here, we're going to see there's the insular lobe deep inside. That's another component of the limbic system, very involved in emotional experience and expression. And if I turned this around like here and then kind of expose this structure here, right here in the medial temporal lobe, this is the hippocampus right here. And just anterior to the hippocampus, deep inside the temporal lobe here, is a nucleus, an almond-shaped nucleus called the amygdala. And the amygdala is really important for emotional experience and expression too. It's a component of the limbic system. It feeds directly into the hippocampus, for example, and it responds to stimuli that are external, that sort of represent potential external threats or external stimuli that provoke powerful kinds of emotional responses. If a tiger leapt at you, your amygdala would go off, pretty intensely, and you would, again, it has like some interesting circuitry that's kind of analogous to some extent to the hypothalamus, but more focused on external threat as opposed to internal aspects of the body, of the internal milieu. The amygdala, responds to visual inputs or auditory inputs, or touch inputs or taste inputs, smell inputs that are kind of like potentially threatening, from external sources. And it also has direct output, neuronal output, to shift on autonomic balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic output. It can also communicate via the thalamus, to areas of the cortex, to alter your perceptual experience. So, it can also directly project into brainstem and, set off, facial expression changes, postural adjustment changes, that are a clear emotional signal to others that you're stressed by something or fearful of something, etc. A great example I heard of this is a famous, story by Joseph Ledoux, who's a famous neuroscientist who's studied, emotion in the brain, fear in the brain. But like, let's say you're walking on a pathway, right? And you see a curved object on the ground, you might suddenly find yourself frozen, oriented, with your leg lifted and your heart going a little bit faster. Well, that curved object, signaled the amygdala to freeze you via brainstem, to orient you via the superior colliculi, to alter autonomic balance, to boost, sympathetic output, for example. And then you're going to then have that transmitted and mapped in insula, where you're going to go like, and that'll be connect with anterior cingulate and frontal lobe areas that are involved in decision making, and you'll be, whoa, what's going on? And it's interesting because the threshold for amygdala activation can change, right? Famously, during development, early in development, we tend to have our amygdalas much more responsive, and we don't really know what the consequences of this is or that is, or what that curved object means, etc. So through development we learn more. Social decision making, some of that involves inhibiting some of that amygdala response, because we go, okay, yeah, that looks dangerous, but I know how to deal with that, so I can damp down the amygdala response and proceed with good social decisions. So anyway, the limbic system is fascinating and really critically important in how we perceive things and and who we are, and really interesting aspects and components of our